Wait. We're live. Go ahead.
Well, good evening and welcome to this special presentation by Believers in Action, which is a small group at Carlisle United Methodist Church that affirms all people are made in the image of God and have equal value in God's eyes. Our focus tonight is systemic racism and the Christian church's role and response to it. I'm here this evening with my colleagues Susan Waybright and Jerry Sturkey. Susan will introduce our guest and begin the conversation. Susan?
Thank you, Jay, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We have received and prepared several questions, but you may also use the chat feature on YouTube to enter any questions you have as we're speaking, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. A few months ago, I was reading a Harrisburg magazine, and I came across a short review of Dr. Drew Hart's book. I thought it sounded like exactly the book that we needed to be reading, and I was thrilled when Drew agreed to meet with us. Honestly, though, I didn't realize how powerful this book would be. In our discussions, we've been challenged, moved, and called to act with a growing understanding of what it means to live like Jesus. One member said Drew got into our hearts, and I'm so grateful tonight to welcome Drew to be with us. Drew, those of us who have read this book learned a lot about your story, but for those who haven't read it yet, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Drew Hart. I'm an assistant professor of theology at Messiah University, and I'm actually now a program director for a new program we've just launched called Thriving Together, Congregations for Racial Justice. I live in Harrisburg with my wife and 3 children. And let's see, originally from Philly. I'm actually like a church boy in terms of like my dad was a pastor and my great grandfather was like a, evangelist and stuff and planted multiple churches. And my great grandfather apparently was a great preacher. So I have that as a part of my story. And yeah, I highly involved in my own community. I'm a co-leader of a group here in Harrisburg called Free Together. And so just connecting and partnering and collaborating with other faith leaders here in my city around just the work of justice and wanting to see the church make visible God's reign here in our community and pursue justice collaboratively with the already good work that's happening here in the city. And so I guess that's a good starting point and introduction for who I am.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew. When you were writing Trouble I've Seen, what were you hoping readers would really take from that? And I guess what were you hoping for when you were writing the book?
Yeah, and maybe I'll set it up with a story of when I wrote the book, right?
Okay.
I mean, I wrote it in a moment when I was actually a PhD candidate at the time. So I had finished all my coursework and working on like comprehensive exams and, thinking about proposals and all that kind of stuff. And that's when the Ferguson uprisings hit. And all of a sudden I was having like this like crisis of vocation. Like, what am I doing in the library tucked away in this moment? I had been doing anti-racism like workshops and, and stuff like that already, and always like for the faith community. And so it just felt, I was just having some trouble. Like, what am I doing? Is this the right way to be going? Is this the way to use my gifts? I don't know. I was just in crisis. But one of the things I decided at that moment was I have something to say, especially because I just felt like so many Christians were not having meaningful conversations in response to what was happening. And so I knew like I had something to say about what it means to be followers of Jesus and also help people think about race and racism in more holistic and comprehensive ways that can help us understand what's going on all around us. And so I wanted to just bring that together. In many ways, it was just marrying the work that I had already been doing and the stories I had been telling and the ways that I've been thinking about it for quite a while. And so my hope was at the heart of it, is to expand from a thin definition of racism to a thicker definition, right? To help people understand in ways that I think that the more popular ways that people think about racism in our society actually don't help us understand what's going on all around us. In fact, maybe you could almost say it misdirects us, right? To not understand. So that's one area is just getting a much thicker definition that helps us see the patterns and think about white supremacy. What do these words mean? I was using that at a time when it wasn't that quite popular yet. Now it's like everyone talks about white supremacy. When I was writing that, people were the primary language and frame that people were throwing everything out of was white privilege. That was like the dominant frame, right? And I didn't think that that was actually that helpful for actually understanding what's happening all around us. And so anyway, so that was one of the things. But I hope that one of the things that people will also get that was really important to me is I want people to see Jesus, right? And maybe that's sometimes not always what people expect when they're even Christians who are writing on anti-racism. But I wanted to invite people into a serious journey of what does it mean to be followers of Jesus? And then how does that relate to us in the context of a racialized society? And so I think that for me, hopefully people catch my love for Jesus and my desire to want to follow Jesus and my desire to want to see Christians not just be Christians in name, but in our actual practice in our lives, that we actually would be following Jesus in the midst of our racialized society as well. So I think those are the big things, right? The anti-racist discipleship is a good way to summarize it.
Right. And I think the way it connected with Christianity was so helpful for me. I mean, I feel like I've read so many books about anti-racism, and which are all very helpful, but the way that it connected with the story of Jesus was just really powerful and helped me in framing that conversation with myself and with others. So I really appreciated that. One of the things that came up in our book group was that this book was published in 2016, which does not really seem that long ago, but a lot has happened, and really actually gotten attention in this 5 years since you wrote it. And reading the events that are listed on page 16 to 18 regarding violent deaths of Black men and women, we know that pattern has just kept going for these 5 years. And there also seems to be more awareness in white America of that. So I was wondering if what you think about that, if you find hope in this time, if there's anything that you would change about the book now if you were writing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? What would I have done? Of course, I mean, anytime you write at a different moment, of course, you're going to change some things because you're always trying to speak at least that's my goal, is to speak as meaningfully into the moment that I'm in at that time. And so my book was pre-Trump, right? In some ways, it was ready for that moment and all the challenges that came in the last several years, but it also was pre that. And so, but even now, right, this new moment that we're in, and I think to think about the conversations around race that are happening, what kinds of conversations that are happening. In many ways, you could argue that some conversations, even as people are awakening, I'm not sure if we're directing people to resources. In some ways, they're not radical enough to embrace the radicalness of the reign of God, right? Which is just so much more comprehensive. And I think that some of the conversations that are happening are more about like making the tweaks in our own lives and things like that, but it's not reimagining God's dream for us in a way that I think is really important for our present conversations. And so if I knew that there was going to be this moment, I might have framed it in some ways to anticipate that, but I don't know. I mean, in some ways, what are you going to do? I could have also, I have had multiple conversations around the language of white privilege. One thing not everyone notices, I don't use that language in my book at all. People are sometimes people will describe it with the language of white privilege. And then I'm like, I actually don't use that as a frame. That's just not the language. I'll talk about systems of advantage because obviously there are people at advantage, disadvantage. I'm just not quite sure that white privilege has done the work that we have wanted it to do. And we could spend some time on that if you want to. But, and I had written about, I have like blogs going back to 2012 talking about why I thought that there were some limits to it. Not that it's a bad term. That's not my problem. I just don't know if it's quite as helpful to get the ideas across, and that the water has gotten muddied a little bit. And so it gets used in a lot of different ways and not a lot of consistency. And I think with that, there's a lot of confusion. And so I think that, that I could have spent some time talking more explicitly about that. The other thing, actually, as I'm thinking about one other thing that I did, which was I tried to, instead of defining things for people, I tried to help them envision it, right? So I tell stories, but I do wonder if I should have given people a little bit more definitions at times, just to pull those two things together. So anyway, those are just strategies. My goal, though, was to not enter into the conversations the way that they traditionally have been entered into. I think that people respond in predictable ways by hearing the same things over and over again. So I've kind of used the metaphor of, what does it mean for me not to go through the front door, but to go and, break in through the side window and then open all the doors and windows from the inside, right? Just to enter in a different way. So storytelling and metaphors and things that I think can help people open up people's imagination for what we're talking about first, before you shut down the conversation with, expected ways of entering into the conversation that sometimes are just not working, right? In terms of actually helping people understand what we're actually trying to get at.
Thanks, Drew. I'm going to turn it over actually to Jerry now.
Oh, you're still muted, Jerry.
My apologies. Yeah. Thank you for your intro there and helping us get to know you and your motivations a little bit better early on. One member asked for help seeing past the dominant perspective, specifically referring to the line for rather than allowing scripture to be read against conquest, colonization, and white supremacy. In some strange way, Christians have manipulated the Bible story to confirm these things and marginalize Christ's centrality in the narrative. She asked if you could give examples of actions of the church that you are referring to here, beyond what you referenced as appalling silence.
Yeah, I mean, what that quote is really getting at is actually, it's two things. One, it's how do we read the Bible is one question. And then the second is what do we do with that, right, in society? I mean, that's really what I'm getting at. It's like, we could spend all day on, let's talk about slavery, right? I mean, I think that's the most obvious and easiest example. The church was split in terms of how they were reading the Bible. In fact, let's be honest, just to messy the waters a little bit, for many folks, they felt like those who were slaveholders felt they had the stronger biblical argument, right? They could quote a Bible verse at you. Slaves, obey your masters. Oh, look at the patriarchs. Like there's ways. And so they had these very simplistic ways that they could quote a Bible verse, extract it, universalize it, and impose it and wield it to reinforce the status quo of a slaveholding society, right? So that's one way. I think that's one easy way. Of course, that's not the only way that the Bible was being used at that time. You have abolitionists who are making much more sophisticated arguments, right? They're not just quoting one Bible verse. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're quoting, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and love your neighbor, things like that. But sometimes more nuanced arguments that are being made because they believe that slaveholding doesn't fulfill the way of Jesus. And so I think that we can also talk about, so that's on one hand is the Bible was used in a whole bunch of different ways, sometimes to uphold violence and oppression and all kinds of horrific things. And other times it was used in the exact opposite way. I guess though,
Right.
Another aspect is to think about like what are the contexts that the scriptures are being written and thoughts and worked out of? And oftentimes the Israelites, they're the little fish in a big pond, right? They're the underdogs in the story. They're under Egypt, they're under Babylon and Assyria and Persia, and then Rome in the New Testament, right? And what does it mean to take Jesus, a first century Palestinian Jew living under Roman occupation, and then to manipulate and domesticate and dilute his image in such ways that now in, like, let's say the 20th century, as lynching is happening, he's identified more with the lynchers than the lynched, right? Even though he was crucified, right? Who, as James Cone says, crucifixion was not much different than American 20th century lynching, right? In terms of mob violence, terrorism, trying to keep control over a population. There's so many similarities there. And yet many white people, many white Christians, right, in the 20th century, at the peak of what they say is the most Christian moments of our society, at the peak of it, people could lynch someone on Saturday night and then go sing "Old Rugged Cross" on Sunday morning, right? So what does it mean to, how are we reading the Bible? In what ways is it confirming the world as it is, rather than opening us up to God's dream and what God intends for us and for all creation? And so I think that that invites hopefully some questioning about how we even read our Bibles. That just saying it's biblical is really not a meaningful answer, right? To just say, oh, well, what's in the Bible is biblical. I tell my students all the time, you can argue almost anything you want to. If you want to just grab Bible verses and align them in a particular way, you could make it say whatever you want to. If you're not, what does it mean to see the story of God's journey with Israel fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ in a particular way that actually is life-giving and liberative and orients us to actually love our neighbors more, right? And if that's not happening, if it's not life-giving, it's not liberative, if we don't actually love God and love our neighbors more, then maybe something's wrong with our reading. Maybe we're not doing it right, right? So anyway, that would, I guess, is the short. I mean, we could spend, again, that's like a long conversation, but I think that there's a lot of different ways that we've used and weaponized the Bible, and then have confirmed the status quo as it is. And unfortunately now, Jesus is sometimes seen and imagined to be a mascot for the status quo, rather than the Jesus we see in Luke 4:18-19, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor," right? And then what does he do through the rest of Luke? Just that, right? Where the first are last and the last are first. And he prioritizes the poor and vulnerable women and the stigmatized, right? And it's really flipping things upside down on their head.
Cool. Thank you for that. And then the next question that we have here, given your mastery of the many examples of white imposition and cultural imperialism, has the concept of Christ as your savior ever been difficult or problematic for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, I'm like, how do I answer that, right? So almost like yes and no, or no and yes. I don't know how to answer it the right way. But I mean, so I guess for me, the issue is not Christ as Savior. It's what do we mean by that, right? I guess that's maybe the way to get at it is, what do we even mean when we say Christ is our Savior? I think that in the West, what has happened to the idea of salvation itself looks nothing like the Hebrew Israel story in terms of what salvation meant in a holistic, thick way. All of a sudden now, what the West has done with it over time is we've diluted it and watered it down to this thin, meaningless thing that's just about, like, you know, spirituality and our afterlife. And that's all that it means, right? But that's definitely not what we see through Hebrew scriptures. That's definitely not what it means. But it's also not what we see Jesus meaning either when he uses the language, right? When we think of his interaction with Zacchaeus, it's fascinating. In fact, I love Zacchaeus. In fact, I spent some time in my new book on Zacchaeus, because what's fascinating is it's all the things that I think American Christians don't like to think about and talk about are all in the story of Zacchaeus, which is why I think we like domesticate the story so much. You think about like the little kid's story, right? You know, Zacchaeus was a wee little man and it's all cute, but the whole song like takes out the punchline to the whole thing. Like what is going on? So the whole punchline is you got Zacchaeus, who's not just a tax collector, he's the chief tax collector. That means he's in charge of exploiting the people. It's well known that that's what they did. And you don't understand the story there with Zacchaeus if you ignore the fact that he's described as chief tax collector. So he's been exploiting his own people, working in cahoots with the Roman Empire. So he's seen as outside of unfaithful, sinful, and outside of God's promises and outside of covenant people because of that. And here comes Jesus into town, and Jesus picks him and says he's going to his house. Of course, that baffles people. Why in the world would you pick such a sinful person? Because it's obvious he's sinful because he's engaging in extremely unrighteous activity, exploiting the people. And then he has a come to Jesus moment, which is, I'm going to give half of my money to the poor, and I'm going to give 4 times back what I have exploited to people, right? So that's both redistribution of wealth and reparations, which nobody wants to talk about. But that's, and it's really a foil from the rich young ruler, right? That's a whole nother story as well. But what's fascinating is that Jesus says in response to that, salvation has come to this house. Salvation has come to this house. Now that's in the Hebrew tradition. It's much thicker. He's actually been delivered from a particular way of life of participating in this other thing. It's much broad. It's not just about your afterlife. It's also about right now. And it's in the tradition that deliverance for the Hebrew scriptures begins first and foremost. You have to remember Yahweh, God's deliverance of the Israelites from slavery, right? That's the reoccurring story that is retold over and over and over again and reimagined to have new implications, because that reveals who God is, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then ultimately who Moses encounters, that God is a delivering God who delivers the Israelites from bondage. And that story is what is going to then therefore be reimagined for what salvation means, given all the different circumstances. It's thick and it's broad. And what Jesus does, he doesn't just keep it, he just extends it even broader to have even more universal implications for all of creation, right? Can anticipate this deliverance and salvation. And so for me in the West, the kind of watered down, weak salvation that has no earthly good. Yeah, I have a problem with that because it's been used actually to justify exploitation, right? In fact, during slavery, this was the move that was made during slavery was, in fact, there were 2 iterations depending on what period, because slavery was not a static thing either. It morphed and theologies morphed during that time. So some of the time you have people saying Black people are bodiless souls, and sometimes there were soulless bodies, right? Depending on what moment you're talking about. But basically it was sometimes they don't really have a soul. They're just bodies. You can do whatever you want to it, right? But then the switch was their souls. And what really matters is their soul, not their body. And so they can get salvation for their soul and we can still enslave their body, right? Oh. And you think about, I hear my students say it sometimes, and I hear people in the present day, well, we've got to prioritize the soul over the body because eternity. So obviously you've got to do that, right? But then what happens is then you actually ignore the very things that Jesus told us to care about, people's lived conditions, right? And so instead of having an integrated body and soul, a whole person, we separate the one from the other and then justify why we must only care or prioritize one over the other, which usually leads to apathy and disregard for people's well-being. And so I think that, again, that's so Christ the Savior, that's good news for me. I guess the question is, what do we mean by that?
Sure. Thank you for that. Very in depth and really given me a lot of insights and things to chew on myself. So that's it. Yeah. Susan?
Sorry. We can go to Jay's question, although Jerry, I know you had a question a little later that you were actually asking Drew about Black bodies. So I didn't know if you'd want to go ahead and ask that one now.
Yeah, I saw the segue there too. So this is definitely a blessed, God-led conversation. Another question that kind of segues right from that one is, from you, Drew, to Yamiche Alcindor, and many more, I've noticed the prevalence of the language of Black bodies. as opposed to Black souls, or myself, or even my experience in the books like yours, op-eds, political punditry. I do believe I understand the desired rhetorical effect of maybe describing the othering of these Black bodies. But can you share your perspective a little further than what you just did, and the history of this device of Black bodies that seems, again, so popular right now, from TV to the news to books like yours?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that the desire is to remain attentive to people's bodily experiences, right? How do we not lose sight of the bodily experience, and that people have different bodily experiences, and that our bodies are, I mean, we could say racialized bodies, marked, right? That is to say, um, because they're perceived in a particular way, will be treated in a particular way, right? And what does it mean to live in a particular body? What does it mean? I always say, when I teach or when I go speak, I'm trying to understand also, like, how are people going to interpret my body? What are they thinking as I'm standing there before them, right? So what does it mean to stay attentive to the body and to take seriously the lived experiences? What's fascinating, and I think he's actually presents a real challenge for at least some Christians in terms of how we talk, is Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's not a Christian at all, right? I don't know if anybody read Between the World and Me, an older book now, a few years old now, but I think really fascinating because his concern is that we've got to really take seriously the body, and he thinks that Christians don't. He sees Christians almost like we're neo-Gnostics, right? That don't actually care about bodies. And for him, he said, oh, look, he's trying to tell his son, look, this is your body. This is the only body you got. You better take care of it, right? Because bodies have been whipped and broken and destroyed, right? So you better love your body, right? And of course, while I don't necessarily share the same overall worldview and theological imagination as my brother Coates does, I do think he actually presents a real challenge because we should be the last ones to be seen in that kind of, in fact, that would have been heresy in earlier, right? Neo-Gnostic kind of, the body doesn't matter and all that stuff is really deeply problematic. The body matters very much. In fact, Jesus, just for the very fact that Jesus took on flesh, right, gives dignity and value to the body alone, that alone. But I think the whole, it's not it's not about a spiritual escape. That's not what Christianity is about. It's about creation and new creation, and very much God valuing creation, which includes us, God's creatures, right? We're part of creation. And so we need to take the body very seriously. Now, in scholarship, there's no question that there's been a trend, as you noted, right? There's a trend growing in terms of just having language to name the body, the Black body in particular. And certainly in my field, I think that it's been led, especially by Black women. Black womanist theologians have been, I think, at the forefront of wanting to name and talk about the Black body and the Black bodily experience. And so I think that that is one of the things that certainly has been around, is just, that's a growing thing that I guess, you engage and you think about, and I'm just a part, I guess you could say I'm also a byproduct of my time of being attentive to these things that have not been, that is certainly in the church in more recent years, there's just not been much attention to Black bodies in the same kind of way, right? And I think that's the same reason why, like, I think James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree is a really powerful text. If you haven't read that, you definitely want to read James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Turns you to the lived experiences of Black bodies in a really powerful way that will both turn you into seeing Jesus's body and his body crucified, and not being the last word, but also then how that then once again gives new meaning and understanding to Black bodies as they were lynched. 5,000 Black men, women, and children lynched, right? Mostly post-slavery. And so, Black bodies, I think it's important to stay attention and to say that bodies matter, and in particular, Black bodies, which have often been devalued and stigmatized and marked as dangerous or problem or criminalized or whatever, right? Needing surveillance and control. What does it mean to remain attentive to those same bodies? In the same way that Jesus also had a marked body as a first century Jewish person who could be surveilled and who could be arrested at nights, given an unfair trial, beaten up, right, by the authorities, and given a state-sanctioned execution where his bodies, literally, the whole point is to put them on, to shame the victim in embarrassment and humiliation and torture before a watching worlds, right, showing the might and power of Rome over the body. And so what does it mean then to, as we remember that body, we also remember other bodies, right? So we remember this crucified body turns us to remembering the crucified bodies of our own world and our own time, and how we ought to remain attentive to the disproportionate suffering that happens in our world today.
Isn't that interesting that in my question there that I talk about the language of Black bodies as opposed to my experience or myself, and you're saying that the self and the experience is the actual embodiment of the body.
Yeah, that they're not separated. I mean, and there's place for that, right? For saying my experience and my feelings, all that. But how do we also recognize that our experience is also bodily, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's really powerful. Yeah.
It's an awesome clarification. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, Drew, it's my turn to switch gears a little bit. You're doing a great job putting out some theological frameworks and definitional information for us. We are fortunate here in Carlisle to have elected a Black mayor, and we have an appointed Black chief of police. And some citizens cite these facts as proof that racism is not present in our community. And even this past week, our borough council, by unanimous vote, created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I quote, acknowledging the existence of painful, systemic, persistent, and varied forms of racial inequity in the borough. And when this commission was proposed, some people claimed it would be divisive and unnecessary. And likewise, many white Christians are not comfortable engaging in conversations about systemic racism, as stated in your book, and I agree with you. So, how do we respond to our neighbors who believe racism is an historical and not a current problem? And what are the best methods to engage our community in fruitful conversation on this subject?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about what I say and talk about, right? But I think I will say this: there's no magic bullet for when people will listen or not. But I mean, I think some of the questions are like, who are we listening to? Who's? I mean, so if someone says to me, we don't need, we don't need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I would ask, who believes that? What is making you come to that conclusion? I want to ask some questions from them about why they would get to that conclusion and what is informing that decision, right? Whose stories, whose lived experiences are actually forming and shaping that kind of position? Is it because they have gone intentionally to hear voices and perspectives that are different from their own, especially from people that were disproportionately targeted in the past and then came out? And, I've spoken to everyone in the Black community, and after hearing all their lived experiences, there's nothing. There's no more stories of racism. There's no more pain. There's no more trauma, disparities. No one could point to any disparities anymore in our society. And so I just can't find it. And if that was the case, they had their honest, gave their best effort, and that's all then I could understand, but I just don't believe that. I don't believe. So I guess, if they're just deciding for themselves because of their own predetermined position, right? Their own taken for granted information that is the case, without being willing to actually be even open to the possibility that there's something else, then that means you're already committed to something that I don't know. I can't. So, and that's when we're committed to a position, no matter where, without thinking about if I'm open to evidence proving otherwise, that's called ideology at that point, right? And there's no magic bullet for if someone is just going to hold to an ideological position. We all have to take some risk in conversation, being willing to be vulnerable and transparent with others. So that would be my first thing, is just, we need to check ourselves. Are we willing to go wherever? And are we willing to ask people who might say something different and then we'd have to wrestle with, right? Because let's be honest too, white people can always find their Black friends that agrees with them, right? And then they find that one person and they say, well, so-and-so said this, so I can reject everybody else. Look, Black people are allowed to have different opinions. There's no single Black perspective on all things, right? But what I do encourage people to do is to engage widely and broadly and to get as many perspectives as possible, not just your one friend that is going to co-sign everything that you say because they already think just like you do because you were raised in similar circles or whatever. That's just not helpful. And in fact, it's disingenuous if we're actually trying to put ourselves in the shoes of others. And so I think that that's important. But if I'm having conversations for real, like, I want to talk about actual disparities in the present. I mean, that's the easiest thing, right? It's not hard. I mean, so I can talk, since you guys are in Carlisle, I know, like, you share my world in terms of overall central PA, like Pennsylvania has enormous disparities in terms of funding for public education. It's enormous. It's well documented. We're one of the worst, and it's extremely racist. And there's a past in history. And in some ways, our state has kind of confessed it because they eventually adopted a new fair funding formula, but then haven't fully implemented all the funds through it, right? So there's a kind of a half confession without fully making all the amends. So we have these radically disparities in terms of the funding for public education. The more people of color in a school district, the more likely they're going to be underfunded. The more white students in a school district, the more likely they're going to be overfunded, right? And if we actually put all the money through the fair funding formula, voila, right? It's going to radically change the game. Millions, I think for Harrisburg, they were saying like $30 million per year more if the state fully used the fair funding formula, right? We're not talking about little chump change. Now imagine what's the collective toll, the snowball effect of all of that over centuries, right? Decades, I guess you say. It's enormous, right? And that's just one thing. We're just talking about public education. We could talk about who has access to this and that, healthcare, housing, all kinds. We could go on and on and on. In fact, our region, I mean, there's just so much racist history. Redlining here in Harrisburg, serious redlining. In fact, the state capitol, right? There was a Black community that used to live there that was displaced so that Capitol complex could live there, right? On the West Shore, I know that we had a student who did some research on one neighborhood on the West Shore. Almost a third of the homes in the archives that had racially restricted deeds on homes, right? And so, like, there's things didn't just happen. We act like it just organically happened where Black people, somehow randomly Black people became disproportionately poor and in ghettos, right? Disproportionately. No, they didn't just, there was federal, states, local, regional laws and policies that were put in place to structure and organize our society as it is today. And the same zip codes that were targeted and redlined, they're disproportionately poor today, right? I mean, it's not hard to see the lines. You have to almost like not, I call it, it's not just ignorance, it's willful ignorance. It's choosing not to know more because the information has always been available. But we can live in communities where we choose to not receive the stories of others. We can choose to not hear and be moved and remain apathetic. And we can also choose to uphold racial narratives that justify why the world, they wouldn't really do well with the funding anyway, right? So no point in giving them because it's not about funding, and we can give all these narratives for why we're going to uphold these great disparities. Or we could try to abolish them and try to find transformative practices that are actually promote equity and flourishing for all people. If we were all about that, then I don't understand why there would be no reason to want to hide from history. There's no rationale. Usually people say, you learn from the past, you learn from your mistakes. But when it comes to Black people and Native Americans in particular in this nation, then all of a sudden we want to be ahistorical and we want to have amnesia, right? When it comes to our past. And it makes sense because then you can't tell these false narratives about American exceptionalism, all this stuff, because you have to deal with what happened on the ground, centuries of slavery, centuries of genocide, forcible removal from lands. In fact, the Carlisle boarding school, right? Horrific, just on the national scale, horrific in terms of what happened to indigenous children as they're ripped away from their families to be colonized and assimilated into white ways of being in the world, right? So yeah, I think that's that kind of ahistorical is just in some ways a confession that people don't really want to know.
Well, I thank you for that. And I can tell you, you can speak for a long time, uh, just on that question as well. I guess the follow up to that is I see that there's a role for something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because it is a public forum, and while they're limited in their legal scope as to what literally the borough government can do to change certain things, it does provide a public forum for people to come forward and in that space and declare their experience and have it be responsibly heard. One of the questions that's come up just as we are talking here is, how would you advise our church to make a difference in our community while also opening up the minds of some church members? How do you really move beyond indifference and apathy? And when you say, like, when it comes to these particular indigenous and Black American stories, we don't want to revisit history. I mean, is there a particular style of dialogue or engagement that says, I really want you to hear me and I want to share some information with you? How can we do that so we both learn something? Why you don't want to learn about it and why I want you to learn about it? And does it make a difference if the church is involved in that?
Yeah. So when I think about like different styles of communication, I mean, what I should say this, one of the challenges that we have to name that cripples conversation sometimes is that we don't name that sometimes there's unequal power dynamics happening in the conversation itself, right? That we're not necessarily let's say if I'm a boss and I have an employee and I say, come up to them and say, how am I doing on the job, right? Let's have an honest conversation. Yeah, right. They're not gonna give me an honest conversation unless it's like, my son or something. Like most people are not gonna tell you, even if you are not doing a good job, they just don't have the freedom in that conversation to just say whatever. So we have to acknowledge that there's power dynamics happening in all kinds of different ways, nuanced ways, complex ways, but there's power dynamics alive. And so how do we create conditions in which people can speak freely and speak honestly? And we're in a society where white people do dominate and control society in general on a broader level. How do we not reduplicate that in our conversations, right? Especially when the fact of the matter is that most Black people are engaging in not only Black spaces, but also white spaces and are much more intercultural in that sense than most white people are in terms of going both ways. And so there's something really meaningful about many Black people's lived experiences. Not everyone is different. So there's no single answer, but in general, there's a lot more, there's a lot of lived experiences. It might be communicated depending on someone's story and stuff. They might be communicated in different ways, but they have a lot to share. And so I think we have to be able to break some patterns, I guess is one way of getting at it. One of the things, I'll just share what I've been doing. So I'm a co-host for Inverse Podcast. I co-host, it's actually Jared McKenna, he's from Australia, right? So we co-host together. But we've also, during the pandemic, we've also started doing book study groups. And it's been fun. We've had people from like all over the world and reading different books at different times and just dialoguing. But we wanted to create a healthy space for conversation. And so we actually put into place some principles and practices for our groups that have actually disrupted what you could say is the normal way that things play out in these kind of conversations. And so one of the things that we did, we had a couple overall principles, just this idea of what I call step forward, step back, right? It was something I would say in class, right? If you're prone to speak up a lot, right? I'm gonna invite you to step back to create a little more space. Not that you can't talk at all, but you want to be attentive to the fact that you're prone to speak more. So you need to give more room for other people to jump in. And also, if you were prone to not say much, maybe been socialized in such ways that you haven't felt like your views mattered, you're invited to step forward. But what we did for Inverse is to be just a little bit more explicit about that. And so we actually said, in particular, we're actually going to invite women of color in particular to step forward, right? Because many times in these spaces, they're being socialized, especially to feel like their voice doesn't matter. And in particular, we're actually going to invite white men in particular to step back. And we actually said, we're inviting you to be first listeners, right? To take that role. And so in being just that explicit, it just helped to create a different kind of culture where now, in fact, it's been fascinating. You listen to most of the white men now, they'll say, I've really valued actually approaching it from wanting to listen and learn, to come in with that mindset that I want to be a learner in this space, and that I'm not the only one who has something to share and offer. And what has been really fascinating for us is in inviting women of color in particular, all folks, we say always invite everyone with who've had their backs against the wall, but women in particular. And many of those women have just felt so empowered by that, and some of them have started some new stuff out of that in other spaces because of that, right? And so just seeing that happen for us has been really meaningful, but it's also just created new patterns where, to make sure that everyone is hearing. Now, we did a couple other things. We also, when we break into small groups, we have them go, so they'll read a passage, and everyone comes ready to share a passage from the book that they liked, and they'll share to others. We bring them into the big group, then we send them back, and we put two groups together, and they need to share what someone else said, right? So it's not just about talking, it's about listening well. And so we talk about, what does it mean to do some sacred listening? Everybody, right? And so this is not going to be, some people come thinking it's going to be the Drew and Jared show, right? Like, no, this is not what this space is supposed to be about at all. If anything, it's upending all of your expectations of what maybe you probably had hoped for and wanted, right, in this space. But I do think, and I'm saying all that not to say that those exact things need to be duplicated in all ways, but I do think that there's ways we can be intentional and thoughtful to disrupt just the way things often flow out, so that we can make space so that the first are last and the last are first in actually meaningful ways, right? So that the very people that Jesus sought out over and over again in his own ministry, the least, last, and lost in society, right? That we would also make sure that we're attentive to them, to those same people. And in doing so, believing that somehow we're also being attentive to Jesus Christ, because that's what he ties together, right? That somehow that what we've done to the least, somehow we've done to Jesus Christ. So how do we remain attentive to Christ through being attentive to others in our community as well? So anyway, I guess that would be, and that's a long, wieldy way of answering your question, but I feel like it's practical, right? To reimagine conversation, because I think we'd like to think that conversation is just neutral, but it's just not really neutral. I know, I'll give one last little mini example. Like, I can get away with a little bit more at Messiah University where I teach because I'm an alum, right? And I also, I'm an author and stuff. And so, I've had a long-term relationship with President Phipps there. I can vent to her. There's something that and I'm really discouraged about what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And I know that many other faculty who came in my year don't necessarily feel that they can do that, right? Because they're like, I don't have tenure. I can't be going to the president venting. I need to, and me, I'm like, I don't care about tenure. I'm just going to go and share what I think, right? So there's some ways in which I also am aware of the ways that I move, but we have to be aware that there's power dynamics at play in complex ways. And which means we all have to be honest about ourselves, to do some self-examination. It's not just merely, I know that, for example, as a Black man, I have more advantages than my brothers do in many ways, right? And also at the same time, when I'm driving down the street, all those things disappear, right, if I get pulled over. So it's complex. There's not a simple formula for everything. But I do think that but it does take self-awareness and honesty and having some integrity to narrate one's complexities of how we move and navigate our spaces.
Well, you have your step up, step back slogan is one that I recently heard at another study that I'm part of. And I think that that's a very good way of kind of proceeding. I mean, we really do need to listen, and we do need to empower people to know that we're going to listen. You know, I want to come back to, this is my final.
Jay,
Hello? Excuse me?
Jay, do you mind if I just squeeze in real quick?
Oh, go ahead.
Drew, I just wanted to commend you on when you talk about your people's ability to listen. Your answers are so complex, but I can really tell that you heard the question. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you very much for being such an adept listener.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to, and I don't feel like I completely answered the question. I think I took a part of it and ran with one part of it, but I am listening, trying to listen well and trying to give a meaningful answer to the questions. Yeah.
Well, these are broad questions. We tried to narrow them from taking them out of your book and, you know, what meant most to us and we thought our audience would enjoy. I want to come back to your earlier comment about your recurring theme that, you know, in your book, that Jesus was not a powerful white man and that his transformation by Western society into this white image is a shameful distortion of the gospel message. So how do we affirm the reality of Jesus's life, you know, which you describe as being subversive? I love the use of that word because it's not the word most white Christians would attribute to him. And reclaim that message of universal message of God's love, regardless of race and gender, et cetera. How do we reframe the white Jesus message in this current environment?
Yeah, I want to push on one word that you used, which is, I want to push against the word regardless. And I want to say in regards, I want to say the opposite, right? But I think it's an important question that you're asking in terms of, you know, well, so we have this, I mean, some of it, number one is we need to understand our history, right? I do think that it's not obvious and self-evident for a lot of people that Jesus is a first century Palestinian Jew. In fact, what many historians would call an Afro-Asiatic Jew, right? That the early church, the early Christians, all that, none of it is indigenous to the West, right? It's what we now call Africa and Asia, right? In terms of that region. And that it was centuries in the making of a story before the West began to see itself as somehow having a copyright on Jesus, a copyright on the Bible, a copyright on Christianity, forgetting that they were Gentiles, right? And imagining themselves that everyone else is the Gentiles who need to be engrafted into their story rather than that they've been engrafted into somebody else's story. And so even just that move itself creates some theological and biblical problems in terms of how we see Jesus, right? Because what happens even you read Immanuel Kant and stuff, and he sees Jesus as like the best of the West, right? He's like, you know, the best. I mean, he's technically Jewish, but he represents the best of the pinnacle of Western achievements, right? So what happens when you think of when Jesus gets distorted in such ways and loses, he's been severed from his Jewishness in all significance, right? And certainly not just the historical developments. Like it's a historical inaccuracy in terms of Jesus. The problem is not just that it's historically inaccurate that Jesus is made white. It's easy to make. It's an easy point to show that it's historically inaccurate, but it's also a theological inaccuracy because of the theological weight of what's happening and what whiteness means, right? Like for example, I often tell people the most popular image of Jesus to ever be disseminated in the world is from the 1940s. It's called the head of Christ image, right? You probably all have seen, almost everybody's grandparents had it in their house and almost most church basements and all over the place, right? And it's white Jesus, he's kind of gazing up into the sky. His hair's flowing back, blue eyes. And he looks so calm and so sedate and so sweet, right? And not a care in the world. Looks like he just came from the spa, right? But this is 1940s Jim Crow when this is being written, right? I mean, when this is being produced and created and disseminated all around the world. So what does it mean to create that image of Jesus at that time? And how does that relate to and help us see the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? The Jesus that was crucified under Roman powers. So I think that whitening Jesus is not just a historical inaccuracy, it's also a theological problem because it misrepresents Jesus's vocation and identity in the world. Right? It's huge when we think about that. So if we're going to reclaim the universality of Jesus, it has to be found in the particularity of Jesus. It can't be found elsewhere, but in the particularity of Jesus. The moment we try to just start in the generalities and in the abstract Jesus, that's the manipulated Jesus already. It's in the revelation of Jesus, which is in particularity, right? The birth, the life, the teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We've got to immerse ourselves in that story, right? It's only when we've done that we have something meaningful to say about Jesus' significance. And the reason why I say not regardless of race and gender and stuff like that is because Jesus meets us in regards to our social location. He doesn't treat everyone the same. Salvation is for everyone, but he engages people in a different way. He doesn't ask everyone to sell all things and give them to the poor, right? No, he says that to the rich young ruler, and that's the response that Zacchaeus has, and that's the response Barnabas has, who is wealthy and has his big field in Acts, right? And so there's different ways that people approach. There's not a one size fits all that Jesus approaches all people for. There's the deliverance for all, but not everyone experiences it. While the poor seem to see Jesus as good news, obviously, the rich young ruler walks away sad. He doesn't see Jesus as good news, right? He can't quite fathom that there's a better way for even him than what he has imagined for himself. And I think that, so that's why it's actually in regards to where we are, that Jesus has a bridge to each and his salvation is contextual to each one of our own social locations and situations and contexts and lived experiences. And so how do we take that seriously, the Jesus story seriously enough to not domesticate it and not to make it a one size fits all cookie cutter, but to recognize that Jesus does have a universal message that has meaning for everybody, and that there's space around the table for everybody. And that's the good news of Zacchaeus, right? That's why the contrast and the foil between the rich young ruler and Zacchaeus is powerful. There's a space for Zacchaeus. There's a space for him around the table, right? That there's good news, that Zacchaeus can see the good news that salvation has come even for him in a way that the rich young ruler just could not see and could not imagine for himself. He thought that he was living his best life, when in reality, it was just a shadow of what God had dreamt up and intended for him. And that it's actually better. And that's why I always tell, like, sometimes we describe everything as sacrifice. White people just got to sacrifice. This is actually a better way. This is not sacrifice. This is better. This is a way to be fully human the way that God intended for all of us, right? This is better for everybody. That's why everyone is liberated in this process. Everyone finds deliverance. Everyone finds that goodness that God intends, that very good creation that God hopes for all of us. And so, I think that that's the task, right? And so what does it mean to love people well where they're at? And to recognize God loves them. I mean, that's, I end the book with Jonah in my new book, right? In my new book. And I love Jonah. Precisely, I can relate to Jonah a little bit. We've all got it. But Jonah makes sense. I mean, let's be honest. Jonah makes a lot of sense. The Ninevites are terrible people. The Assyrians, they're horrific, violent, they wipe out the northern kingdom. We know they're terrible, right? Of all people, who wants to be sent to the Ninevites? Nobody. I mean, they would put their heads on spike. It's long. I mean, it's well documented how horrific and violent and terrible they were. So of course he doesn't want to go and preach a message to the Ninevites, right? God sends him anyway. We got this fantastical story, the fish and all. All right. So he finally gets there. He still just angry about it all, gives this mean fire and brimstone message. You're all gonna burn. You're done. It's over, right? That's his message. Everybody repents anyway, even responds to that. Even the animals, right? And then because of that response, God relents, changes his mind, it says in the story. And because of that, God is going to forgive them, right? And give them a second chance. Jonah is angry. This is really the pinnacle is chapter 4, right? Jonah's angry. No, he knew. That's the punchline is, I knew, God, what was going to happen. I knew what was going to happen, that you were a loving God, slow to anger, right? Ready to relent. I knew what kind of God you were, right? Jonah's problem is not sinners in the hands of an angry God. It's sinners in the hands of a loving God, right? And even had enough love for restorative justice, even for the Ninevites, that there's a path for restoration for them too, that they can turn and that they can find wholeness and oneness before God also, right? That's the power of the Jonah story. And Jonah's struggling with it. And I think that if we could understand and see that there's a path for everybody, that's the power of, like, when we talk about like restorative justice, that's the significance of it, is that as Christians, that we've got this kind of loving God that, and Jonah is in conversation with Nahum, which doesn't see that, right? So Jonah's speaking back against another prophet who has a thin vision of God's love for others, especially Israel's enemies. And Jonah's like, no, it's much more expansive than that, right? And Jesus picks up on that, love your enemies, right? He picks up on that. And so what does it mean to recognize that? And this is important, especially for, I'll give a challenge for white Christians that have been on the anti-racist journey, right? What does it mean now when you've been on a journey and your family and friends aren't, and you just want to cut everybody off and say, I'm done with everybody because you don't get it? I think this is a challenge, right? That there's a place for restoration and restorative justice, even for them. And that, in fact, I often say, it's not healthy for white people to just be cutting everybody off. Number one, maybe it creates a false narrative of one's own journey, as if you had always been there and had been on a journey, right? But also then it imagines that there's no path to restoration for other folks that aren't where you're at as well. So I think that these are great opportunities for folks to get captivated by God's love, the universal implications of God's love for all people. But that doesn't mean God's love is not a one size fits all. It doesn't mean that we engage everybody in the same way. Everybody can't be engaged in the same way. In fact, Jesus was very harsh with some people, especially when they're harming others, right? There's some strong ways in which he shows up, but he still shows up. And I think that, what does it mean for us to show up in that same kind of way as well?
Well, thank you very much for your heartfelt and impassioned reminder that the gospel message, does speak for itself, but we have to continue to proclaim it and affirm it and engage people with it. Yeah. Susan?
Oh, Drew, I feel like we could sit at your feet and listen for a long time. We have a lot of questions, and it's really helpful to hear these stories. And I feel like the way that you share them and speak them is just it's wonderful. So thank you. It's 8 o'clock here, but we did have one question I think you might actually be able to do a pretty short piece on, and then I'll just ask you the closing question here. So one that had gotten sent in, it kind of relates to what you were just talking about. It says, what would Jesus do in regard to the Capitol stormers as compared to Seattle rioters?
Yeah, I almost want to say, go read my second book. I have a whole chapter called Liberating Barabbas, and I can't unpack the whole thing now.
You can say that. That's okay.
Yeah, but Liberating Barabbas in some ways is, in fact, you could actually argue that the first two chapters, both in some ways, they're not exactly, but they kind of are wrestling with some of those questions, right? But it is, one of the things I will say this, the problem with what happened at the Capitol is not that they went in and disrupted a sacred institution, because Jesus does that in all four Gospels. That can't be the problem. And I think it's been problem in terms of many Christians who want to oppose and challenge what's happened. but that in and of itself can't not in and of itself be the problem, that they disrupted a space, right? Now, I think we can say, what was the goal for what they were trying to do, right? And I think that is maybe the vision that what's the vision for the world that they were seeking and pursuing, right? In the midst of diminishing control over society, these white people wanting to gain back this power, to shut down democratic processes, to regain control over society, for a vision of something that is ripping away, which is, let's say, deeply white supremacist in terms of its history of the kind of power and control that has been wielded in the past, right? So we can think about it in that way in terms of what was being pursued, what kind of actions, and certainly not in life-giving ways were they engaging that space. But I'm against the idea that they're wrong by matter of fact that they disrupted the Capitol. I actually don't think that's what was wrong about it. I think it's the vision that they're captivated by white supremacist vision is the problem, and that the power dynamics, that they're not able to accept a changing society that is actually becoming more equitable. It's not an equitable society. It's not just society, but it's becoming more just and more equitable than it ever has been in the past. And I think that that is some of the problems. And so I'll give a teaser on Barabbas, which is just to say that Barabbas in all four Gospels is described as an insurrectionist. He's been watered down and dismissed and turned. He's been just as distorted in his image as Jesus has in the New Testament, I think. And we ignore all the obvious clues around who he was, and many of them tell you exactly who he was, right? Some of those, he participated in the uprising, right? Some it says like he was a bandit, which if you lived in the first century bandit is actually a euphemism also that's being used to describe that kind of revolutionary activity. That's the word that would have been used at that time. So if you look at other literature in the first century, that's the language that you would have found. But I understand why not everyone understands what's being described there. So I get into all that kind of stuff as well. But anyway, Jesus actually has a lot in common with Barabbas in some ways, but it is also going about it different means as well. So you could actually say the difference then in this case is Jesus and Barabbas actually have a lot more in common in terms of the vision that they want, shalom for their society. They want the end of oppression and things like that. But the means that they're going about it aren't the same either. But Jesus in Luke 19, you read Luke 19, and he's as he's approaching Jerusalem, he laments and he weeps over it. He doesn't condemn angrily. He actually weeps over it because what's going to happen, which is that Rome is going to they're going to come down and destroy Jerusalem. And we know that from history, from the 66 to 70 AD, there's this enormous Jewish-Roman war, right? And all of the Gospels have Jesus kind of predicting and anticipating this war in terms of how they're written, right? And so that's what he's talking about there. But it's not a condemnation of their actions. It's actually a lament. And there's multiple laments in these kind of forms, right? And he actually says, if only you had known the things that would make for peace, right? So that means the problem isn't that they all wanted shalom, but how they thought you were going to get there, they were actually engaging the very same means to get there that the rest of the world does. And Jesus had a whole different way to go about it, right? So there's actually a lot in proximity between Jesus and Barabbas, and hopefully Jesus should turn us towards empathy towards those that want justice, but aren't necessarily going about it in the way the kind of radical, subversive, but nonetheless enemy-loving way of Jesus in pursuing justice on the ground. And so I think that that's an invitation for us that is challenging. But anyway, there's so much more in there that I think if anybody's interested in that question, chapter 2, one of my favorite chapters in Who Will Be a Witness is chapter 2, and it dives really deeply into that.
I love that. And that was actually one of the final questions here was going to ask you to do a little book trailer for that. We finished the first one and everyone's like, wait, there's more. we need to get that book. So I just wanted you to encourage people to read that with us, and I'm really glad that you did. And I think so just as a final thing here, then if you can just give us like what would be your hope for the next step? And we are right here next door to you, right? What would you be hoping that Christians would do after reading these books?
Yeah, I think there's two temptations for churches to fall into, one of two traps, right? One is to become the church that just does book studies, right? So it's just perpetual book studies. And it's to imagine that intellectual thought and conversation is the work, right? So we just do book studies perpetually and like, oh, well, we're doing, we read this one, now we read that one. Look at us, we're good Christians, are we? Right? That's one way to go about it. The other is to just start running and just, oh, we're just going to do things, and not be self-aware, and sometimes causing more trouble, right, and pain than one isn't even aware. And I think that the invitation when we think about discipleship is it's a really integrated way in which we can think about our lives, seamless, right? In terms of just thinking about an ongoing way of life of discipleship that first and foremost is committed to the way of Jesus before anything else. Let's not lose sight of Jesus. It's not just becoming anti-racist just for the fun of it, but it's also believing that, in fact, using that language I just used in the other point, the things that make for peace, that Jesus actually has a way forward for us to pursue shalom. Let's follow the way of Jesus. Let's take the life of Jesus seriously. Jesus, I believe, is inherently anti-racist. If we understand his commitments, he will orient us in ways that challenge white supremacy and injustice and oppression and domination in our world. There's lots of good news there. And as we do that, which is both, it's holistic, our way of thinking and seeing, but also how we live in action, right? The discipleship is not just about book studies, right? And devotions. It's about following Jesus into the world. And so if we're doing that, then we want to bring together both ongoing learning and action, right? In fact, people in scholarship sometimes talk about praxis, right? Which is practice and self-reflection coming together, right? Ongoing self-examination, ongoing learning, but also action. So it's not just intellectual exercising our minds for the fun of it. It's also not just going out trying to be white saviors to the world, but ongoing learning in the process. There's a lot of unlearning that we've got to do. And let's be, none of us will just have all the answers. It's going to be ongoing groping because we're deep into centuries of mess. None of us who are alive today created this mess, but we have inherited it, right? And if we've inherited it, how do we move forward as faithfully as possible as we can? And I don't believe you can do, in the midst of centuries of white supremacy, centuries of colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, up to the present day, all the racial disparities that exist in our society, I don't think you can faithfully follow Jesus without being explicitly anti-racist and decolonizing in terms of our journey. And so we've got to take up that work. Again, we didn't choose to be born in this historical moment, but here we are, and we've got to be faithful as the church. So we've got to chart new ways, confess, lament, repent, right? And move forward. And so hopefully that integrating both ongoing learning and action in the way of Jesus can be a way forward. So I don't know where your church leans in one way or the other, but if they're leaning in one way, and so let's say if we're thinking like, oh, we might just get stuck reading books, then let's also make sure that as we start, if you start, Who Will Be a Witness will be a great one actually because it's going to challenge you around that, right? To open up even deeper ways to think about praxis. That's where the book is going. And so it's going to invite you to, so you need to be thinking about that as well. And how are we going to do this and be accountable to others? So we're not just lone rangers in it, but as communities of faith, that we're making visible the reign of God in how we gather and scatter into the world.
So you're giving us permission to read one more book.
Hey, I won't complain about that. No, that's what it's designed for, right? The next book is, I was engaging people around the first one, and I realized, I heard a few people saying like, all right, well, what do you want us to do justice? Like, what does this mean? What does that look like? And I was like, all right, let's jump into the deep end together, right? Let's do this collectively. But my hope was, which I think differentiates it. I mean, it's different anyway, but one of the things that differentiates it from other books is its imagination for congregations to do this work. To really think, take seriously what it means to be the church and to be a Christian community together. Because I think what happens right now in our moment is a lot of people feel like they have to be lone rangers because they don't know how to do this collectively. How do we invite an imagination where we can do this and go on a journey together as a community and pursue transformation both internally and externally in our world with integrity?
Driven.
Wow, hallelujah. Your chapter 9 of Trouble I've Seen was a teaser
Yeah.
for the next book. So
Yeah.
we will be reading it, and we'll be letting our folks know when we're going to start it. And like this time, we'll make sure we get some books from you. I know that's a better deal for you, but
However you get it.
yeah, thank you very much. Susan?
Yes. Drew, just thanks for being here with us tonight and answering questions from all over. And we appreciated the book so much, and just hearing, I feel like the frames that you give us are just so helpful as we try to move forward and being better Christians. So so thank you, Drew. Thanks for being here tonight, and thanks Jay and Jerry and everyone watching too. So.
Yep. Thanks for having me. This has been really good.
Cool. Bye-bye.
Take care.